in the Environment and Climate Change team there, and I will serve as moderator for the event today, which is focusing on leading the way towards a just green transition using economic, social, and cultural rights as a guiding compass. As you may see on the screen here as well, we have some excellent speakers with us for this event. We have first and foremost Astrid Puente-Triaño, who of course formerly was the co-director for AIDA for almost 2 decades, leading its important work on human rights, the environment, and climate change in the Americas. And she has also worked on the climate justice movement more broadly, including working with leading environmental and human rights organizations such as the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Network. We have Rodrigo Ichikova, and apologies to any of the panelists if I mispronounce any of your names. He is the Director of Strategy and Advocacy at the Global Initiative for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. He's an economist who has worked on promoting democracy and citizen participation, and also served as the first director of a movement advocating for a Latin American green transition with social justice. Then we have Natalia Gomez Peña, who is Earthrights Climate Change Policy Advisor, and who also previously led Civicus advocacy around civic space in Latin America and environmental rights. Looking forward to hearing from you as well, Natalia. And last but not least, we have Kayenga Muruyisito, who is a network coordinator of Community Transformation Foundation Network, or COTFONE, which is a community network based in Greater Masaka in Uganda, which is focused on access to basic social services, including, of course, human rights protection, child protection, and land and property ownership. I should say that Kayenga is experiencing some internet connectivity issues, but we hope that we will have him with us at least in audio form. So those are our excellent speakers and panelists. The way the session today will work is it's structured in 3 sessions. So we'll start with a first session discussing some of the current trends, followed by a discussion on experiences, policy recommendations, and then we will also have a concluding session focused on questions and suggestions from you, the participants, as well. Throughout the webinar, we would very much welcome you to share your inputs through either the chat here on Zoom, or you can also ask your questions by writing them in the dedicated Q&A as well. Feel free to note if you're addressing them to any particular panelist, or if it's a broad question that all panelists could respond to as well. And of course, also feel free to share ideas and recommendations and examples from your own work as well. So just to sort of get started, I wanted to share a few points as well about human rights and just transition before going into some of the questions to the panelists. Of course, and as I'm sure many of you will know as well, the High Commissioner for Human Rights has, of course, also highlighted the importance of achieving a just transition for the realization of human rights, and noting that it's critical to ensure both a just process of transition as well as just outcomes. In this context, she has emphasized gender equality and the rights of women, noting, for instance, that women are frequently underpaid and overrepresented in precarious sectors and jobs without access to social protection, and also highlighting the importance of strengthening women's land rights and labor rights, access to financing and technological tools, and supporting their meaningful participation and empowerment to participate in shaping climate and environmental action. Human rights mechanisms more broadly has also engaged on just transition. One recent example is the Human Rights Council Resolution 4911 on the right to work, which includes a reference to just transition. As I'm sure many of those listening in will know as well, the Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change has, in his first report, which is being presented to the Council today, noted that one of the priorities for his mandate will be to address the protection of human rights through just transition for workers in industries that contribute to climate change. and the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environment, among others, have also engaged with this topic. So I wanted to start us off by asking Astrid, how would you describe women's role in the green transition and elements of gender equality in the green and just transition?
Thank you very much, Amanda, and good day to everybody. One of the key things as we have listened in terms of green transition is for the transition to be fair, to be just, and to include human rights as in the center. And of course, as women, we are half of the population in the world. So the key role that women can have is, as men, being including in having a leading role, and also being able to participate in all the steps of the process. As we heard from Amanda, and as we know from data, unfortunately, that's not the situation that we are seeing today. And specifically, we have to remind ourselves that when we're talking about the green transition and these processes, we are starting from unequal situations that women have in several parts of the world, especially in the global south. And so thinking about the role, it's not only about saying and making sure that there are priorities and spaces for women, but specifically this green transition needs to be proactive to actually include all kinds of women groups from all experiences, backgrounds, and also groups. When we are talking, of course, about women, there's all sorts of backgrounds and realities that women have, of course, as any group in the population. So specifically, it's important to think about women that can be or are already in vulnerable situations that because of these inequalities might not have the same opportunities to participate or to have access to the resources needed to even contribute, but of course, implement key actions for the just transition. And to name some of the groups, definitely it's key to include the voices, experiences, and the knowledge and science from indigenous women, also women from African descent, campesinas, workers, migrants, young women, also women from the LGBTQI communities. And of course, it's not one of the other. There's several women that, I mean, we're not one silo of a specific thing, but making sure that all of these roles are included in all processes. One of the key things that we're missing today in terms of the green transition is that, and we're going to discuss that a little bit later, is that it's only being implemented or mostly being implemented from one perspective. Most of the implementation and efforts are still business as usual. And what this is happening or causing is that, as data shows, is that it's not effective and it's not being effective as we need. So making sure that the role of women in all places includes a leading role, and it's all not used as a token as it has been described in several spaces, but it's actually a participatory role that is being heard and seen as a main role, especially in the solutions that were yet to be seen in terms of the effective transition that the world needs.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Astrid, also for bringing in the diversity, of course, of all women, and also for highlighting the situation of persons in vulnerable situations. And I might just take this opportunity to also note that the panel discussion, the annual panel discussion at the Human Rights Council on climate change and human rights will take place on Tuesday of next week, and it will focus on persons in vulnerable situations as well. I wanted to give the floor to Natalia to speak on the same question. Over to you, Natalia.
Thank you, Amanda. And I think following on Astrid's points, something that we are seeing at Rights International is that women already are leading that fight for the just transition. Women on the front lines, women indigenous defenders, environmental defenders, are leading those fights in their territories to protect their territories, to demand a green transition, to demand climate justice. So that's something that women has been doing for many years and are already leading the fight. But at the same time, because of that work, women are facing a huge amount of repression and violence, and a specific gender-based violence because of that work. We have heard from defenders that they are being harassed because of their role as environmental defenders, but also because they are women receiving specific gender attacks. We have heard from youth activists in the Philippines, for example, how they're being called, how the government officials are calling for more school and less activists, or for women to stop wearing skirts or things like that. So all these youth students that are going to the streets to demand a green transition, to demand climate justice, are really facing a lot of repression. And this is something that we're seeing around the world, as I was mentioning, against women, indigenous leaders. So I think that that's also something important to take into account, how the green transition cannot mean that women need to expose their own lives and their own bodies to demand that green transition. And then the second point that I wanted to make is that I think at the policy discussions, women are also starting to lead those spaces, and that's something that we have identified that is really key. There is no way that the green transition is going to be just if women that do not have a seat at the table at the policy discussions, but still there is much work to do. I think that last year at COP26, I remember there were some data that around just 4 or 5 head of delegations were women among 190 something countries. So I think that really speaks on the gap that we have when building that just transition. The good thing is that I think there are several women that have now involved in the policy discussions, and I know there are several states working in a gender approach to that policy discussions. So I think that that's a good step. But still, if we look at the decision tables, many of them are not led by women or even allow women to participate. And more importantly, they don't include women in the front lines. So I think that that element on how can we be more inclusive and how can we really catalyze the action of women, and especially women in the front lines leading the fight for the just transition, is something that we really need to keep working on.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Natalia. And I think thank you also for highlighting, the situation of environmental defenders, and again, sort of speaking a little bit to what are the elements of meaningful participation and empowerment that could really make a difference in climate action as well. I see Rodrigo wanting to come into this point as well. So over to you, Rodrigo.
Thanks very much, Amanda, and thanks so much to Natalia and Astrid. I absolutely agree with their points. And maybe one of the questions that I think is guiding this first section is a little bit on what are the main challenges we're seeing for just transitions today. And I think it's important to look at the broader context as well. We're in an economic system, a social system, a globalization that is meeting its limits. And we see it materially when we look at the climate emergency, when we see growing inequalities, but we also are seeing it politically. And we're seeing it when new political alternatives are coming to the scene that are criticizing the current model in a way. And they're doing it sometimes from the left and sometimes from the right. And these are a matter for concern and a matter to take into account, because I would say we're in a moment of building alternatives. This is a moment of trying to build and imagine new ways forward. So I'd say one of the main challenges we face as civil society and as citizens in general is to help imagine and structure and look how these alternatives may look like. Alternatives that allow us to stabilize the climate and to protect biodiversity, but also to expand radically the guarantee and the enjoyment of human rights. And in some moments, I think sometimes even inside the human rights movement, human rights are seen as a defensive tool or instrument. So it's sort of something we use to stop something bad from happening. But I think many organizations are trying to wield it as an offensive tool towards substantial transformation of our models, and we need to be able to use human rights. I know we're going to discuss this a bit more further on, but human rights are an instrument for social transformation, and we shouldn't be boxed into the defensive part, but on the contrary, on the offensive. And in this, women will play a key role, right? So many human rights mechanisms have already recognized the importance or the vulnerability of women to climate change. We see it in HRC's resolution in 2017, CEDAW's general recommendation in 2019, and the treaty body states joint statement as well. And we also, but at the same time, we're seeing that they're being sidelined in the most important moments of participation. So in leadership positions or in participation when projects are opening public participation, it's not necessarily including with the importance it has women that are in the local communities. So that's something that must be addressed. And I just wanted to mention a couple of examples that I think, although different, can sort of help us look at where we're seeing issues and how we can move forward. So the first case I wanted to bring up is a case of the Gunasikaru wind farm in the Istmo de Tehuantepec in Mexico, that it was conflicting with the local community of Unión Hidalgo. So it's a renewable energy project, but it was stepping on the rights of many local communities there, and especially of women that organized to try to stop these projects. And just recently, a few weeks ago, the government and the courts decided that the project would not go forward. So this is an example of how renewable energy must not be working, and how it must include spaces of participation and real power to women and communities on the ground to guarantee benefits, but also to be able to integrate with the local structures for it to really allow us to support broadly just transitions. And another example that I wanted to bring before my time runs up is about a small community in Chile called Ventanas, that was established as what is called in the country sacrifice zone. So it's basically a zone in the country where regulation is a little bit more lax and allows more industry to be placed. And there was a copper industry there that was having terrible effects on the local population. So there was very grave cases of intoxication in 2011, 2018, and recently in this very year. And the new president in Chile has announced last week that they will be shutting down the copper industry in the community, and that they will be investing elsewhere in a new, more modern plant. And this has had a very important pushback from workers in these industries. And the president has promised something called Comisiones de Transición Justa, or just transition commissions, that are able to not come with a detailed recipe of how to move forward, but to come together with local communities and see what are the local needs for this transformation of the economy in this place, and then more nationally, require social institutions to be strengthened, economic investments to be made. So I think it's an interesting example of where pushing forward environmental protection is having backlash from local communities, but that it is also finding ways to guarantee that that transition is just, and it can be looked as an example from which we can draw learnings in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rodrigo. And I think actually that provides us with quite a nice connection to a question that I was hoping to ask Kayinga as well. Going back to sort of the work at also national level and indeed even at the local and community level, where of course, Kayenga, you were working as well. And I wanted to hear if there are examples of your work and also some of the opportunities and challenges that you're facing in relation to a green and just transition in your work. So Kayenga, over to you, and hoping that the internet connection enables your participation as well. If not, maybe we will save the question for Kayenga at the moment, and with the hopes that he will be able to rejoin us. And Kayenga, if you're able to hear me as well, do feel free to also write in the chat as well to share your reflections there. But I see Natalia raising your hand. So over to you, Natalia.
Yes, thank you, Amanda. Yeah, I just wanted to bring on, to also comment on the topic that Rodrigo was talking about the challenges of the just transition. And this, I think that the point on how human rights should inform just transition is still something that we really need to work on. Just last week, I think we saw news of this land eviction in Tanzania, of Maasai communities being evicted in land close to the Serengeti National Park in name of conservation. And that is something that repeats around the world. And that is something that cannot continue to happen. So I think that that demands challenges both from the states, but also from civil society organizations that work on conservation and that still work in silos, that still are not working with communities, that still are not making sure that communities' rights to information, to participation, to consent are fulfilled. And that is something that we really need to work on. And then the other challenge that I think Rodrigo also touched on was the issue of participation and how we build a just transition that is participatory. I think one of the biggest outcomes that I highlighted from one of the recent IPCC reports is that it's not only speaking about what needs to be done, that is act now to avert the worst effects of the climate crisis, but also how we should do it. And in the how we should do it, the science is telling us very clearly that it needs to be in a participatory way, that decision-making that includes people, that includes community, are decisions that are better implemented and have better results. And that also applies for how do we build climate resilience and how do we achieve a green transition. But what we see in reality is that that is not being implemented, sadly. I think that in 1992, when the Rio Declaration was adopted, it created this paradigm of environmental democracy and access to information and participation, and how it completely changed the scheme of governance in terms of creating a mechanism for people to really participate in those decisions, and talking about a vertical model where everyone could participate in the decisions that affect our environment and our rights. But sadly, that is not still happening. We still see in the communities that we work with many challenges in just accessing information about the projects that are going to affect their land, the policies that are going to be implemented in this just transition, and way more challenges when it talks to participation, and especially participation of indigenous communities. So I think that that participatory model really needs to be a step up, and the transition is not going to be just if it's not a participatory transition.
Excellent. No, thank you very much, Natalia, and thank you also for, I think, bringing in and sort of back to some of the elements that Rodrigo and others were also highlighting in terms of both, participation and engagement in the policies, and then in the implementation of policies and legislations and agreements. I want to give the floor to Astrid, please.
Thank you very much, Amanda. And to complement what Natalia was saying, a few things also that Rodrigo mentioned in terms of challenges. I think that the main aspect that we need to focus on today is that, and it's painful, especially for me, that I have been working so many years on climate and other people as well, is that what we are doing today is not effective. And it's not something that we are saying only from the human rights perspective. Science data concludes, as we have seen systematically from the IPCC and the UN GAP report, that the climate action today is not effective. And it's not effective not only from the human rights perspective and to reduce inequalities, it's not effective to solve the climate crisis, reduce emissions, and increase the protection of the land. So the challenges that Natalia is mentioning in terms of the conservation of the land is not only about the human rights and the protection of indigenous peoples, that of course is key, is showing that these kinds of actions, and we see that, as she mentioned, all over the world, are not being effective. And so that is one of the key things that, unfortunately, it links to the challenge of what we call implementing what is, in theory, the green transition as business as usual. And we cannot do that. The solution of the climate crisis is not going to be implemented and achieved with band-aids. We have to think about structural and profound changes. And it's not only what the human rights community says, the IPCC from the scientific perspective has been saying. And one of the challenges I see, there are many, but I want to highlight a couple. One is that I mentioned, that we cannot solve the climate crisis in the same way and with the same power dynamics that it was created. That has to change. We have been saying that for decades, and it's not been done. And the second element that is linked to this is the constant conflict of interest or corporate capture that we are seeing on climate action. We have to go over that. Again, it's not only from the human rights perspective or the obligation, it's just because it's not being effective. And we need to include that science and data and perspective in the solutions to actually change the tracks, and we actually change the actions that are mostly receiving all the impacts and all the resources specifically. Of course, in that, when we change that and we reduce the corporate capture, hopefully we will be able to increase political will and have the resources and the financial support that the climate action and the green transition needs, but in a way that the human rights are in the centers. Again, not only because it's ethical and moral, but because we need to increase effectiveness that we're not seeing today. And I want to leave it there.
Thank you so much, Astrid, and thank you also for linking in the sort of business and human rights dimension of this, and of course linking back to some of the points that were mentioned earlier in relation to environmental democracy, access to information, as well as, of course, from a human rights perspective, it is also a right to science and the best available science. So that also links in there. I wanted to then actually move to our second session already, believe it or not, and start by asking some of the questions that we've already touched upon a little bit, and I think Rodrigo referenced this in his remarks as well, but what are some of the roles that economic and social and cultural rights can play in the just transition? And I wanted to start perhaps with Rodrigo on this point.
Thanks, Amanda. I'll try to continue a little bit what I was starting on there, because, and I've been discussing this as well with organizations that are maybe not exactly from the human rights world, and the discussion. So why should we use human rights as a driving force or an umbrella for these demands? And I think one of the main advantages it has is that it is part of the global language we discuss. So international relationships, globalization in a way has been established under this common language that allows us to go further than just saying, hey, this is a moral imperative, right? There is a global south suffering, there is biodiversity urgencies that we're seeing, and it allows us to go into this common language that has been established during the last 70 years and that says, here is something on which we have built the common foundations of our relationships. But I also think, and this brings me a little bit to what Astrid was saying, it's not just a common language, it's a common language that goes beyond brute force or the power dynamics of the past. And it allows us to build this guiding function or this compass to say, hey, this is a language that allows us to go forward, to expand human rights. So it has this enormous social power. And also touching a little bit on what Astrid was saying, it's a language that allows us to rethink structural institutions and economic systems. So it's not a language that works on the borderlines. It's a language that has the power to say these ways of economic systems have to be changed. These social institutions must be strengthened or empowered. So I really think, and the bet we've been developing at the Global Initiative is for human rights and economic, social, and cultural rights in particular to become a guiding compass that is able to show the way, to light the way towards just transition. So we're not 100% sure where this will take us, where the horizon is, how these new economic institutions and social institutions will work, but it does give us a perspective and a lens to say it has to include these levels of participation. It must respect these rights. These are the margins or the borders that allow us to know if we're moving forward or not. And I could go a little bit further there and talk a little bit on steps, but I'll leave it here so everybody has a chance to go on the economic, social, and cultural rights part. Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you so much, Rodrigo. I want to see if we're able to bring in Kainga here. I know that he has been struggling with his internet connectivity, which is, of course, also often can be a hindrance to meaningful participation as well. And we hope, Kainga, that we will be able to have you with us either in audio or in chat format. But let me see, Kainga, if you're able to hear us and the connectivity is strong enough to engage right now. If not, maybe I will ask the same question, so the sort of general question on the role of economic, social, and cultural rights in the just transition to Natalia.
Thank you, Amanda. Yeah, and I think that building on what Rodrigo was saying, I see economic, social, and cultural rights not only as the guiding principle for building a just transition and guiding that vision, but also as a benchmark to evaluate how we're achieving a just transition or how we are not. I think that social, economic, and cultural rights give us the perfect benchmark to see how that green transition is looking, how that green transition is being built, and how that green transition is being implemented at the local level, at the community level. So I think that that role of, I think that the fact that we already have a benchmark is something really important, but perhaps it's still not being really accepted by all the states and by all the stakeholders. So I think that we really need to keep working on that vision on how human rights are the guiding force for a just transition, but also how social, cultural, environmental rights are also that benchmark to evaluate how that just transition is being built and implemented. And then going back to the part on participation that I think we have really been talking about this in this space, and I think that That's mainly because I think that's one of the bases of building a just transition, making sure that it's participatory. I just wanted to quickly touch base on a tool that Latin America has built that I think really enables that participation in a just transition framework. And that is the Eskasu Agreement, which is a regional agreement on access to information, participation, and justice that was adopted in 2018. I have been serving as one of the representatives of the public under that process. And Eskasu is not only recognized because it's the first treaty in the world that specifically includes provisions for the recognition and protection of environmental defenders and their organizations in the continent, in a continent that is the most dangerous for environmental defenders. But also Eskasu is recognized, and I think that's one of their main advantages, because it builds this notion of participatory sustainable development, giving tools for people to really access information, to access participation, and to access justice when damage is done. And that participatory approach is what is needed to build that just transition, as we have been talking about during this whole space. So I think that working on these regional frameworks that can allow countries to better implement access rights are a basic tool to achieve a just transition. And this is something that is also true for Europe, that has the Aarhus Convention. And this is something that I know colleagues in Africa are also very interested in, on how can Africa have a similar agreement. But again, I think that the importance of having a participatory approach also means that we need to build those tools, both at the national level with national implementation of these rights, but also at the regional level with this type of frameworks that allow countries to share experiences, to build cooperation, and to build a common standard around the region to make sure that we can have a participatory just transition.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Natalia, and also for linking to the point almost about what steps indeed are necessary at the global and regional level, and also for highlighting the Eskasu Agreement and of course sort of corresponding agreements and developments in other regions as well. I wanted to flag as well, I'm sure colleagues and participants are already aware, but this week as well, there's an extraordinary session of the Aarhus Convention where they're appointing a special rapporteur on environmental defenders as well. So more to follow for that region as well. And I also wanted to just take this opportunity to encourage those listening in and participating in the conversation to do feel free to share your ideas and questions and examples of engagement either in the chat or the dedicated Q&A, which you can find at the bottom of your screen as well in the Zoom window. But perhaps I will also, building on the points that Natalia just raised, ask the question to Astrid in terms of this issue of what steps and tools perhaps also are necessary both at the global and regional level to achieve just and green transition.
Thank you very much, Amanda. So one of the key things that unfortunately has been very difficult is to advance effective actions. I've been part for a few years in the climate negotiations internationally that have been very important and at the same time very frustrating, because we have not seen the commitments, but especially the follow through with the commitments that states have been doing, especially from the global north. And really, I want to make and highlight the difference and the importance of states that have contributed mostly for the climate crisis to be able to assume the responsibility and implement solutions. But not only states, but also non-state actors. One of the key elements that is surprising maybe for a lot of people is to see that scientifically is proved that more than 70% of historic emissions to the climate change are linked, and this is historic emissions all over history, are linked to about 100 companies. And this is something that we have to incorporate in the climate action to be able to actually advance the green transition and specifically climate solutions. And in this linking to what we're talking about, how the importance of economic, social, and cultural rights, one of the key steps is also to see what has been working and what has not been working. And in there, what we have seen is that lack of education, lack of adequate food access, lack of adequate housing that are part of the economic, social, cultural rights are one of the risks that are being threatened now and increased by the climate crisis, and is key to advance this. And we have other tools like the ODCs that will be able to help this, but it's not only about indicators, it's about what people are doing in land and how can these things be implemented. So definitely another step is to be able to increase and concrete the financial solutions that the green transition needs. And again, we are talking also about global south situations. And where we're talking about this is not only between countries, but between societies in our own countries. Speaking about data as well, and the IPCC has concluded that 10% of the population in the world is responsible for 50% of the emissions. And so when we talk about green transition, we need to talk about consumption and the inequalities, not only in the impact, but also in the sources of the emissions. And so in thinking about steps, we need to advance the education of all population, including this 10% of the population that is, by the way, has the highest socio-economical power, so that they will be able to assume the responsibility and be responsible for their emissions and help in implementing the just transition worldwide. So we're talking about steps in terms of states, of course, international institutions as well, be able to put in practice all the human rights obligations and recommendations, but also in terms of non-state actors, some specific groups in the population, and also, of course, individuals.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Astrid, and also for linking back to some of the points mentioned earlier about data and science, information, and of course the role of non-state actors as well. I see Rodrigo raising his hand, so over to you, Rodrigo.
I just wanted to come onto that discussion of what Astrid was mentioning of, okay, so it's not just states, there's companies, there's people. And I think it really talks to the power dynamics that we were mentioning earlier on. And basically, I'd say when we talk about just transitions, there's two key elements, right? Movement and direction. And today we have to do so much more on the movement. We're not moving fast enough. The IPCC is very clear that we're lagging behind on the speed of the transition. But second, the direction, we know it has to be rights enhancing and expanding, and not something that will be of a cost and a negative effect on those most vulnerable. So that's where, and here we come together again on our ability of thinking just transitions is key in building that social power as well. So we saw this in France with the yellow jackets, right? Where there's environmental regulation, but that is having a disproportionate effect on most disadvantaged communities and on those that are earning less. And we have to be careful with this. And we're seeing it in Chile in the example I just mentioned. We're seeing two conflicts here. There's workers that have a legitimate concern on their ability to sustain their life, but also the local community, that most of the people at the local community are not even working at that factory, in that industry, and that they are concerned with their health. And these conflicting communities that today seem conflicting, we have to build alternatives where they are not conflicting, where they are allies and they're on the same team. And I think that the Just Transition movement has the power to bring together young people that are concerned with the future of the planet, working and middle-class families that want to be able to sustain their ways of life, but they see the risks of the climate emergency as well. And also indigenous peoples, not only because this is a doorway towards protecting their lands and their rights, but because this is a topic where their experiences and their knowledge and their concepts of welfare and well-being are going to be key in designing the economic institutions towards the future. So if I may go a little bit forward here on how maybe the United Nations human rights mechanisms and the role of civil society can help in this direction. I would like to mention that the UN human rights mechanisms are ever more getting a stronger focus on climate change. So at GI, at the Global Initiative, we do a study with CIEL, another organization on environmental law, that we look at how the human rights treaty bodies are addressing climate change in their decisions and their resolutions year after year. And we are seeing an increase on how the proportion of resolutions and decisions that are focused on climate change. So if in 2019 it was 28%, in 2020 38%, last year 2021 53% of decisions, resolutions have a link to climate change. We're seeing as well as last year the recognition of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment as well. And these responsibilities, in a way, are generating obligations that go beyond just nations, because the climate emergency, as we all know, is something that has responsibilities that are not just national but global. So if I could close with a couple of ways forward that I see, is the importance of these treaty bodies and going towards building or imagining or focusing on the alternatives we have to bring. So it's not just recognizing the rights, it has to start showing the way towards how these alternatives are built, how we can reshape this international framework. And one example of this is, for example, fiscal and tax cooperation. So we all know that the climate topic has this huge demand from the global south to develop a loss and damage financing system. And that may allow us to finance the damage that has already been done by the pollution and the greenhouse gas emissions during the last 150 years. But we're missing that there's also these structural financial systems that are depriving global south countries from the necessary resources they need to be able to advance in adaptation and mitigation, but also to be able to finance the loss and damage that is being generated in their countries. And these international financial systems are designed and kept in place by global north countries as well. So we're seeing tax competition that in the last 35 years has reduced the corporate tax rate from 49% to 25%. And that's an issue that has an effect on the resources global south countries can use. Or tax havens are allowing corporate multinational companies, many of the same companies Astrid was mentioning that are the main culprits of the climate emergency, to deviate $200 billion a year from global south tax revenues towards tax havens. These are important amounts of resources that must be reallocated towards global south that need to face these emergencies. And these are types of institutions where human rights mechanisms can start showing the way and pointing out the obligations of global north countries to address the issue as well.
Thank you so much, Rodrigo, and thanks for also connecting us to the question on human rights mechanisms. And I would maybe just also highlight here that the Universal Periodic Review has also seen an increasing number of references to climate change, environment, disaster risk reduction in the recommendations between states as well, with a large number of them recommended as well. I want to give the floor to Natalia to also speak to this question.
Thank you, Amanda. And yeah, I wanted to touch base on something that Rodrigo was mentioning about the role of UN human rights mechanism. And I agree with Rodrigo that is there has been a great advance on how climate change and just transitions are being dealt by human rights mechanisms. And the several resolutions and statements, they have really paving the way, or really having a human rights approach to the climate crisis and to building a just transition. And that's, I think, something very important, and is the work of many of the people that are here, actually. But at the same time, I feel that there is still a huge disconnect between what is happening in Geneva and what is happening in human rights mechanisms and what is happening in other UN fora where policy that is going to affect the green transition is being built. And I especially see that disconnect between at the UNFCCC forum. So when we go, when we are at the climate negotiations, human rights and environmental, social, cultural rights are still a sideline topic. And I think that we really need more coordination and dialogue between UN entities, and specifically UN human rights mechanisms that are the ones leading the way in terms of the implementation and compliance of human rights, with other UN entities that have a mandate of building this policy, of facilitating these conversations where states are discussing how to build that green transition, to make sure that human rights and economic, social, and cultural rights are a basic element in that conversation. That is still not happening, and is still kind of shocking when you see, for example, the UN Secretary General being very vocal on what needs to be done to address the climate crisis, on what needs to be done to guarantee human rights. But at the same time, looking that when you go down the chain of command, that message is just very diluted. And it gets to conversations where climate change is not connected to human rights at all, where states are discussing mitigation without any notion of human rights, adaptation without any notion of human rights, and that is not going to build a just transition. So I think that now that there is a UN Special Rapporteur on climate change and human rights, I think that's going to be a great tool to promote that coordination. But we really need that UN human rights mechanism and special procedures can really shed that light and can really speak up on what needs to be done, and speak up not only in events and not only by via the reports, but speak up to those that are taking the decision, and also, more importantly, in my mind sometimes, to those that are facilitating these conversations. So to those UN entities, those UN secretariats, the climate change secretariat, that are the ones doing all this work to bring parties together to discuss these things, to achieve decisions. There needs to be an open conversation and open dialogue, and especially coordination among the different UN entities, because the UN is doing an amazing work on human rights, and there are so many special rapporteurs that have been putting reports on climate change and the different implications of climate change. But then those results and those conclusions, I don't really see them in other forums where those policy decisions are being made.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Natalia. And I think also your remarks made me think of two things. One is something that I don't think any of us have mentioned earlier, and apologies, Rodrigo, if you did and I missed it, but of course also in the concluding observations of treaty bodies, more at sort of the national level, there has also been increasing references to environment and climate change, and it's also a sort of interesting resource and source of information and further engagement as well. On collaboration and coordination, really important point. I think one of the elements that we've seen over the last few years has been, with UN interagency collaboration, has been the collaboration under the Secretary General's call to action for human rights. which has a dedicated action area on climate justice. And that has enabled also UN entities to collaborate on issues around participation of children and youth in climate action, and also developing stronger guidance on protection for environmental defenders as well. So it's coordination is a very important point there. And of course, we've also seen, as you were mentioning as well, Natalia, that special rapporteurs and other independent experts and mandate holders are also increasingly issuing joint statements in relation to environment and climate change as well. I wanted to perhaps ask the same question to Astrid as well, in terms of the engagement with, action of, follow-up to the UN human rights mechanisms, and perhaps the UN system more broadly, both at the global and regional level, building on the point and emphasis on coordination that Natalia brought just now.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Just to complement and give an example of what Natalia was mentioning, and I completely agree with that in terms of the need to increase a comprehensive perspective, and with the challenges of the complexities of this situation and the challenges of different mandates and different agendas, make sure that there is an actual advance and avoiding working on silos. And we say this a lot, pretty much in every panel. And I have seen interesting advances on that. For example, seeing UN Environment now, at least as I see it, working more systematically and coordinated with the UN Office on Human Rights. Now, there has been interesting and very important efforts to increase this coordination. So that definitely has to continue, and to include and make an analysis of why is that we have resolutions, recommendations, etc. But several aspects, and as Natalia was saying, at the UN climate change negotiations, these are not yet being able to impact, especially on key issues like loss and damages, and the solutions for climate-induced migration and displacement, for example, and the delivery of the financing and the financial support that the climate change and the just transition needs. So thinking about that role, one of the key things that I think that both in general at the UN human rights mechanisms, but also in general at the UN, is the inclusion of more voices from the ground. That is something that is key, and we're happy to include some examples of work that we all, the three of us, have been working on, etc. But we're not from the communities, we're not directly impacted in a way that other voices are, and we need to include that in all steps and actions, and we have seen that in several examples. Another aspect I think that is key in thinking about the evolution of the law and the interpretation of the law is to continue with the development and hopefully advance the interpretation of the legal and the treaties that we have and the legal framework that there is. And one key thing that I can think of is, for example, the decision a few years ago from the Human Rights Committee on the Kiribati, the family that was seeking refugee in New Zealand. And one of the things there that was echoing really the interpretation also of national courts was the level of the burden of the proof that people that are seeking refugee is being asked in terms of climate is very high. And so one of the things that I think is key in general for human rights entities and organisms is and authorities is to think and from the inequalities and consider the inequalities and the differences of power and consider science that is already there and change that burden of the proof so that people that is already living all those inequalities and the challenges of the climate change impacts, by the way, people that are less responsible for this are not also having to have the burden to prove what already science has been saying. And the last aspect that I want to mention is to continue and help identify and call the attention on false solutions. That is something that the IPCC is already identifying. And I think that there's a huge and key role from the UN and including the human rights mechanisms to highlight the false solutions, because we cannot continue lying to each other. And that is what the planet basically is doing. So identifying these false solutions and giving light and identify the effective alternative that there are, because there are many. Just to talk about one sector, and I will end with this, in the energy sector is systematically being proved that instead of mega projects, even if it's solar or wind projects, mega projects are not as effective as, for example, distributed energy and projects that can be developed and managed by communities. And this is something that can be key role for the UN to highlight and to even make databases and highlight the amount of examples that there are worldwide, so that these projects that are more effective in a lot of ways, including reducing inequalities, poverty, and more effective in terms of cost investment, can be supported more.
Thank you so much, Astrid, and thank you also for highlighting the sort of what are some of the positive examples, how can they be found, built upon, engaged with, etc. We actually had another side event at the technical meetings of the Climate Change Convention in Bonn just last week, where we had some discussions with colleagues from the Right to Energy Partnership with Indigenous peoples, which was very interesting as well in that context, I think. I wanted to also see first, again, if we're able to bring in Kayinga, please do let us know, Kayinga, if you're able to engage at any time. Also bringing some of the community perspective that Astrid was highlighting just now and emphasizing the importance of. And I wanted to also ask to all of the panelists, you know, what are some of the ways that civil society and other actors can engage with these human rights mechanisms, and perhaps with other UN processes as well? You know, what are your experiences? What has worked well? What are some of the lessons learned from your own engagement with these processes? And maybe starting with Astrid.
Well, I was just going to jump in. So I think that the first, and maybe apologies for the obvious part of the answer, but the first thing that is key is to use them. And it's key sometimes, it's challenging. There's several different entities and processes, but one key thing is to strategically use the UN mechanisms, but not only at Geneva and New York, that, as Natalia was saying, is in general very far from territories and what realities sometimes we're facing, but using then all of these resolutions and references and recommendations nationally, both with communities, but also within courts and states. One of my experiences that has been key is that when we use those kinds of standards, if it's both special rapporteurs visits, the recommendations, it helps states to do the right thing. I remember years ago, in early 2000s, when in Mexico there was a dam that was being proposed, violating a lot of human rights without a good environmental impact assessment and violating indigenous people's rights. And it was a hard possibility to convince the government to do the right thing and comply with their own laws and framework. Two special rapporteurs did a visit to Mexico and did a report, including and calling the attention from Mexico to have in mind indigenous people's rights. And that helped the government, but that, by the way, government has a lot of people behind, a lot of agencies. And so it allowed the Human Rights Agency to have stronger arguments so that the dam finally was canceled, or at least paused for until now, for 20 years. There's another example in Colombia that is between the 4th and the 5th country that exports coal worldwide. And so it's very hard there. It has been very hard to even talk about just transition there, talk about solutions and how to go beyond coal. And one thing that has been happening, especially in the North part, is that with all the perspectives and conclusions from the UN and the science highlighting the link between coal to human rights violations and also for climate change, it has helped to advance the conversation on how it can actually be, or we can talk about a just transition. And by the way, this is an example that of how the coordination between different organizations can work. And hopefully the government will take into account these proposals, because now indigenous peoples, women organizations, environmental organizations, and also unions and workers and scientists and environmental organizations are working together to identify a proposal for how a just transition in the north part of Colombia that is linked with coal can work. And one of the key things there has been all the standards and recommendations from the UN mechanisms. So basically in the civil society that is very diverse, as we know, is using this both sides very strategically, and to make sure this is the work that a lot of us have been doing to make sure that all of these recommendations and standards are applicable and can make a change in the ground.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Astrid, for those examples, and over to Rodrigo for your views.
Thanks, Amanda. I don't have so much to add after Astrid. I think she said a lot of important things that I agree with. I'll just add 2 points. In the agreement with leveraging UN resolutions and basically the UN framework and the human rights framework for advocacy on an international and a national level, I think that's a really important challenge. And it's a challenge that goes both ways, because sometimes the UN civil society ecosystem is too far away from the national CSO ecosystem, and we require that to be closer together. So it's both leveraging what comes out to the national level, but also bringing those real issues on a national level that sometimes we say, no, we can't take this to the UN because they discuss on another topic or in a different language. And if UN spaces aren't able to really include and address many of the issues that are happening on the ground and people, that's where I think there's this risk of losing some legitimacy. And that takes me to the final point that I would like to make, that is, first, agreeing with what Natalia said, that human rights mechanisms many times are much more advanced on these issues and these criteria and these standards than we see in other UN spaces. I think there's a challenge of bringing substantial demands to UN spaces as well. So in a way, as Astrid was mentioning earlier, like, this is not moving a couple of commas in the model. We need structural reform here, and sometimes that is at a different speed or a different tradition than what many UN spaces have had. But I think that there is at least an avenue where they shed light. I think that was the word Natalia was using. So it would be interesting to shed light in these different directions. So just a couple of ideas there on how. Sorry, can you still hear me? Okay, no, some Zoom issue came up, but no, just to finish here on what I was mentioning on tax issues. So today, international tax issues are addressed at the OECD, and that is a space that is more close to Global South, that is that has a higher importance for Global North countries, and there is space for human rights mechanisms to highlight the obligations countries have in discussing these issues on more democratic spaces as well as the UN Tax Commission. And the same happens with vaccine patenting or issues on public services. So I think there's a challenge there of how we can leverage also the new UN human rights mechanisms towards these substantial demands that are going to be key in coming years as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rodrigo, and over to you, Natalia, for your views.
Thank you, Amanda. And yeah, I agree with Astrid and Rodrigo on the importance of using all these resolutions and reports at the national level to inform and to support litigation, to support policy discussion, to support advocacy. I think that civil society has been doing that for many years and in many countries with a lot of success, because I think those reports can really guide those processes. So that has been a really important, also a benchmark for us. But also, I think recently we have been working a lot with a report by the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Assembly about civic space and climate change. And this is a report that touches on a topic that has not been really dealt with, that is the level of repression and violations of rights of climate activists that are demanding that just transition. So that report, I found that it was very, very important to bring a light on that issue and also set some standards on what freedom of assembly in the context of climate justice look like, and what are the challenges, and what are the opportunities, and what are the standards that states have under the international human rights framework. So we have been working around that report and with that mandate and supporting the dissemination, but also with specific advocacy around the report's recommendations. And that has been very useful for us. But I think that there is still many challenges for civil society to continue doing that advocacy with reports, and to look at those reports as advocacy tools, especially when special rapporteurs have 2 reports a year, and then they move to the next one, and they move to the next one. So I think there is an element of continuity there that needs to be really think on and work on. And then that also places the challenge that many of those reports are only useful if civil society groups, if activists take them and use them. But because most of the time, my experience is that reports are presented in Geneva, reports are presented at the UN General Assembly. There is a really nice and interesting side event to present it, and then that's it. I think that also speaks of the challenges that the special rapporteurs have. I know that there's challenges in terms of budgeting and staffing. So those real issues needs to be addressed. We need to strengthen those mandates to be able to have a comprehensive approach when a report, for example, is launched. But at the same time, that also speaks about the coordination aspect. So you have all these reports that are speaking about the specific issues that states are discussing in different policy forums, but then those reports are not really being used to inform those discussions. And then civil society sometimes, many times, we also have so many capacity constraints that is very difficult to continue a process of engaging with the report and continue using and pushing those recommendations. So we have very important reports, very valuable recommendations that sometimes just get diluted into everything that is happening. So I think that is still a challenge on how we can really build long-term processes around those reports and around those resolutions too. And then I think there is also the challenge on really making sure that, and I'm speaking specifically on special procedures, how special procedures can be that voice that guides in different UN forums. Because again, I come back to the point that I think sometimes those discussions are just being held in Geneva, and those discussions are not being translated to all the other forum, or even at the national level. I think special procedures have a really key opportunity to participate at national level discussions and also serve as guides on what a human rights implementation look like in the different arenas, and especially in climate change and building a just transition. But those opportunities also, of course, demand capacity. So I think that also empowering special procedures and requesting them to be really outspoken on their interpretation on human rights, on the standards that they are building up, or that they are providing light, it's very important.
Thank you so much, Natalia. And just for colleagues listening as well, I shared the report that Natalia was mentioning as one of the examples of engagements as well in the chat. If people are interested to read more, there's a few additional examples in the FAQ, and of course in the joint publication between the Global Initiative and CIEL that Rodrigo mentioned as well, and which is also available in the chat. And I wanted to briefly also take this opportunity to say that, of course, again, those listening in, participating, do feel free to share your own examples, questions, recommendations, etc. You still have a few more minutes to do so. So any follow-up questions or thoughts, do feel free to share with us. But I wanted to, based on some of the points that we've been discussing about ways of engaging with the human rights mechanisms, with the UN more broadly, again, emphasizing this point of coordination, to also go back a little bit to conversation about what are some of the milestones that you yourselves have been involved with in terms of promoting just transition, promoting a human rights-based approach to climate change as well, to get some inspiration and ideas from those examples as well, perhaps. And perhaps I will start with Astrid on this question.
Thank you, the older one, I think, in the panel. So I think that the couple of milestones that bring me to attention is, so first of all, helping and being part of the negotiation of the Paris Agreement so that human rights were included in the text. Many of us wanted human rights to be included in the objective in paragraph 2, in article 2, I'm sorry, of the Paris Agreement. And it was difficult, but it is included still in the preamble. And that was very important. And I think that it was very important in 2015, and it was hard to achieve. But now when I see in the negotiations, as we have referred, and Talia referred specifically also, the difficulties of making sure that the climate action and every climate action includes human rights, it really makes me think how important it was to achieve that inclusion. And it's not only about words, it's mostly about making sure that actions are having this human rights perspective, on all human rights perspective in the center, including indigenous peoples that are mentioned there, the youth, workers, women, all of those groups that people can say, oh, if you only say human rights, everybody is included. We are not included until we are mentioned. And that is something that is key. The other milestone was last year, the recognition by the Human Rights Council in the UN of the human right to a healthy environment. There is a resolution that was very important in October, and that was the same day the creation of the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Climate. That was something that a lot of us worked for years, that was finally achieved. Again, not because the road ends there, it's actually the path starts there, both with the resolution and the Special Rapporteur. And we're seeing, and hopefully that the General Assembly will make the declaration of the right to a healthy environment soon, in a few weeks. And in addition to that, the importance of those milestones is because there are decisions that we are using every day, that a lot of communities are using and states are using to improve what is being done. And the one thing that I will highlight of both of the milestones is that it was done after a very hard work coordinating with a lot of organizations. And going back to what civil society can do, it makes me think also about the importance of working together, because we know that, and we have to remind ourselves that not only one person or an organization or even a sector of the civil society organizations will achieve the solutions that we need. We need to work together. And sometimes the human rights world is one planet, an environmental world is another planet, and the climate change is another planet, but we are in the same planet. And so we need to have that coordination. And that is something that we achieved during this couple of milestones that I mentioned. That of course I was a small part or important part. Doesn't really matter the judgment of that. The important thing is that it was part of a large coalition and implementation and very hard work from a lot of organizations and also states and UN entities as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Astrid, for those examples, and also referencing the developments in the General Assembly at the moment. I wanted to maybe ask Rodrigo the same question.
Sure. So I'm going to point out something I mentioned briefly earlier, and then try to explain why we think it can be important and it can be a useful milestone towards the future. So this is the case of the wind farm project in el Istmo de Tehuantepec in the Unión Hidalgo community in Mexico. So it's a Guna-Sicaru wind farm, and it's been going on for a few years. And as I mentioned earlier, recently it was decided to suspend this project. Now, I think it's an interesting case because what it shows is that the human rights standards are not achieved just because they're written in paper. They're achieved when what is in paper is leveraged and advocated and moved forward by different organizations, local communities, and also civil society organizations. And in this case in particular, you had a very active local community in Unión Hidalgo, but also an alliance with an NGO called Prodesk, where we also contributed with different letters of allegation to special procedures, and that finished with these special procedures sending letters to the government of Mexico, to the government of France, and to the energy company that was a French energy company. So it's a case where these human rights standards come alive in a way, right? So they show how extraterritorial obligations must be triggered and have a role in these types of projects, and also participation of different communities. But then in the angle that we really focused and stressed in these letters to the special procedures was that women were being left out for specific because of the specific structure of the participation process. So these are cases that bring these human rights standards to life, and in a way can inspire and show a way of how future transition projects must incorporate these standards. So I'm going to leave it there and say this is a milestone that we think is hopeful in thinking of just transitions towards the future.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rodrigo. I want to ask the same question to Natalia. I also want to thank the comments that we received in the chat. So thank you very much for that engagement, and thank you also, Astrid, for already responding to it in the chat. And I wanted all panelists to think about your sort of closing recommendation or point that you would like participants and others to bring with them after this conversation. But first, I wanted to ask the same question to you, Natalia, about milestones and other ways, examples of engagement.
Thank you. Yeah, I think to answer that question, I'm going back to a topic that I already briefly touched on, and was the Eskasu Agreement. And I think this is a really interesting milestone for civil society in the region in terms of building environmental democracy towards a just transition, because it's an agreement that would not exist if it wasn't for civil society leadership. And I have been working in Eskasu negotiations for the past 9 years, so pretty much my whole career. But the idea of having a regional treaty to really implement those access rights in Latin America and in the Caribbean, given the challenges that environmental democracy and especially defenders face in the Americas to protect their environment, were highlighted by civil society since many, many years ago. And with civil society leadership, we were able to get champions among states, among governments, to lead a negotiation process that ended up with a regional treaty to implement those rights. So I think that civil society leadership in terms of identifying what are the gaps, and then finding solutions, and then building the political will to advance on that negotiation was key. And then the other aspect that I wanted to build, that I think also speaks on this issue that we have been touching a lot during this space, and is the importance of participation, is that Eskasu was built using a model and was negotiated using a model with some rules of procedure, some rules for the participation of the public, of civil society in general, that have been very progressive in terms of what international negotiations tend to look like, and with a set of rules that allowed civil society to have a voice at the table. That is something that never happens. So in the case of Eskasu, we were able to achieve some rules of engagement that allow civil society to have a specific seat at the table, to bring proposals to the negotiation tables, that allow civility that when we bring one proposal and that proposal was taken by one of the states in the negotiation, that proposal then was reflected in the text in negotiation, which dramatically changes the situation and the way that civil society can engage. So I think that, and then we were able to have a public regional mechanism where anyone that wanted to participate in the negotiation can just subscribe and then start to receive the information and start to assist the negotiation meetings. Everything was public, everything was streamed. So I think that those standards have been very important for what Eskasu is, and really brings on the idea that if we're talking about people's participation, you cannot have a closed door meeting that restricts the participation. So that idea, I think, of nothing about us without us was really true for Eskasu. And that's something that I think needs to be reflected in other forums where these policy decisions are being made, because we cannot speak about a just transition if there is no participation. And that applies both at the international level, at the regional level, but also at the national level. So I think that the standards that Eskasu has built in terms of how can civil society engage in building these frameworks, in building these policy decisions, are very important, and that's something that we really need to build on. States that are party to Eskasu have an obligation under the treaty to really promote civil society participation in these spaces, and that's something that we really need to build on to build that green transition that we have been discussing about.
Thank you so much, Natalia. And it was almost a sort of perfect concluding remarks. I'm hesitant to even say anything else, but I want to invite all of you to say very briefly, what is the key thing that you take with you from this conversation? Can be a word, can be a process. We've discussed about the importance of participatory approaches. We've discussed that this is something that is being engaged on not just in the human rights ecosystem, but also the IPCC, highlighting both the importance of and the importance for a human rights-based approach for the efficiency and sustainability of climate action as well. And we've talked about issues around non-state actors as well, and several, I think, important and inspiring examples from all of you. But if there was a closing point that you would like colleagues to leave with before we end this interesting discussion today, and maybe I will start with Rodrigo.
Okay, I'll go very shortly with a sentence, and I think it's we have a challenge that is for human rights to be understood not as something that blocks the transition, but that allows it to move forward more quickly with a broader social support. And the challenge there is to reach out to other organizations that maybe don't engage so much with the human rights world, but they can see it as an instrument.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Over to Astrid.
Thank you. What this reminds me is the importance of talking to each other and learning from each other. And complementing what Rodrigo was saying, I think that it's key to even lose our own fears and step out of comfort zones and really try to, as in nature, pollinize each other with ideas, with solutions, because we have to stop thinking about, and I'm not thinking about us here in this panel, but in other spaces, we have to stop thinking whether just transition and green transition is possible. We have to start thinking and acting about how it is possible, because we have to solve it. Climate change is the challenge of our generation, and we have the historic responsibility to make it happen. So definitely having human rights inclusion, participation in the center is one of the things that is demonstrated that it works. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And over to Natalia.
Thank you. And I just want to make two brief points. One, just taking some of Astrid's and Rodrigo's ideas. If human rights are this common, international human rights framework is this common language that we can all speak about, that is the perfect tool to really catalyze coordination among both UN entities, but also different policy forums, and even among civil society groups that we also tend to work very much in silos. So I think that we have the tool, we have that common language, as Rodrigo was mentioning. We really need to deep coordination and to promote dialogue. And then the second one is just going back to the issue of participation. A green transition is not going to be just if it's not participatory. So I think strengthening those frameworks for environmental democracy, strengthening our access to information, strengthening participation is key in this framework.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for capturing so much, even those brief concluding remarks to all of you. And I want to thank all of the speakers for the discussion today. We're sorry that we weren't able to bring in Kayinga in the discussion due to internet connectivity, and we'll see if there's other ways so we can bring out some of his perspectives, at least in writing and summary of this event. And I want to thank, of course, also all of the attendees and participants who have been listening in and engaging with this space, and to the Global Initiative for coordinating and bringing us all together today. So thank you very much. I hope you have a rest rate of the morning, day or evening, depending on where you are, and looking forward to continuing the conversation and implementation of these issues going forward. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you as well, Amanda. See everyone soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye, thank you.